place in the early morning hours of September 17th are tragic. I have spoken to Thomas's mother, and I feel for her. We empathize with her. To be very frank, all of our hearts break for her. These events will have a lifetime of impact for the family, for our officers, and for the community. Decisions that are made in seconds will last for eternity. Such is the nature of policing. Society places our police officers in dangerous situations and expects them to make difficult decisions and be right each and every time. I have that same expectation. Then we evaluate their decisions in the bright light of day and inspect their actions when we have time, a controlled environment, in the calm of our office and homes. As police officers, we expect scrutiny. To be very honest, we welcome it, because that's what a just society does. It's part of policing a free society. There are those who would seek to disparage Thomas McClain or vilify the police officers for their own selfish aims. That is not acceptable. Reasonable people seek to build a civil society, improve government service, and advance the quality of life in Eureka. That is the purpose, the effort, and the aim of all of us here. The purpose of this briefing is to provide you with information that is transparent and open. This investigation is conducted for two reasons. One is to provide a report to the district attorney for review and to the community to make a sound, rational judgment based on facts that occurred that night, not on wild speculation and internet rumor. As chief, I want the community to have confidence that this investigation by the multi-agency critical investigative response team is being handled thoroughly, objectively, and professionally. I am confident the ongoing investigation is reaching those goals. And I really want to thank all those people who are involved in that team. They've put countless hours of effort and energy and intellect into this, and many of them are here today. I am also confident that the facts of this case support the actions of our officers on that night. Here's what we know about the events on the night of September 16th in the morning of September 17th. 3 police officers were assigned to track down Duncan Devine, who was a fugitive. Citizen information told us that he was living at 1620 Allard, number A, and that he was likely armed with a 9mm handgun. 2 uniformed officers were put on foot to conduct surveillance from the cemetery directly across the street. A third was in a roving black and white police car in case there was a foot pursuit. And as it would turn out, Duncan Devine was captured by our POP team last week after a foot pursuit. Operational plans were drawn and submitted to the on-watch sergeant. The sergeant took a look at those plans and adjusted them. The initial plans were to assault the house, go inside, and take people into custody. That's a high-risk environment. We did not have enough staffing for it, and it would have been much easier to get them out in the open with less opportunity for problems. So the plan was altered, and therefore 2 officers were on foot doing surveillance, waiting for him to either come out or to come home, and that would allow us to get him in custody. About midnight, as the officers were watching that house, a car pulled up and dropped off 3 people at 1620 Allard, number B. The 3 occupants eventually went into the house. However, one person, Tommy McClain, came back outside. Within a few minutes of him being outside, a blue Ford pickup came and parked across the street from 1620 Allard. The lone occupant got out and was confronted by McClain. He thought McClain accused him of dealing drugs. He was actually there to visit a friend who lives close by. Officers witnessed the confrontation from not too far away, and after the man left, McClain appeared to be puffing up, pushing his sleeves up, and intently watching where the man had walked, tracking him to the home where he had gone. McClain did one other thing that was important at that time. He indexed, or what's called a safety check. And people who carry firearms, and we know this because many of our people carry firearms off duty, you subconsciously check to make sure that that firearm is secure. You'll see people pat with their wrist or take their thumb and put it over the weapon to make sure that it's there. The officers noticed this. At that point, a weapon was not seen, however. One of the officers got on the phone and immediately notified their sergeant of their observations. They were concerned that if the driver of the truck came back to that location with a man who had already confronted him, they were going to have an armed confrontation. In a police officer's mind, that is a moral responsibility to try to prevent violence. Sergeant Stevens directed the officers to stay in place, but to have the roving officer drive by the aggressor's location in an attempt to force the man with the gun back in the house. It was a sound, well thought out tactic. Oftentimes, people who are holding dope or guns will see the presence of a uniformed police officer and avoid conflict. They will go back into the location where they have safety. Officer Linfoot drove by at a very slow speed. We have this part on video. After he left and went by, as he passed, Tommy McClain pulled the handgun from his waistband and cycled the slide. As many of you who have handled weapons know, that you rack a gun or you slide, you pull the slide back, it allows you to charge that weapon to be ready to fire. It feeds the bullet from the magazine into the firing chamber. So Tommy McClain pulled it out of his pocket, out of his pants when the police officer drove by, cycled it, and then put it back in his pants. There was no doubt in their mind that they A, saw the weapon, and B, heard the cycle of the slide, raising the level of threat at this time. Sergeant Stevens drove into the area as Officer McElroy called him on the phone. Sergeant Stevens used his spotlight in his car to illuminate Tommy McClain standing in the front yard. Officer McElroy told the sergeant, yes, that is the man with the gun. Sergeant Stevens immediately got out of the car and began to give him clear, concise commands to gain compliance, as we always do. Earlier this morning, we had exactly the same situation where a person with a handgun, acting bizarrely, walking down the street, was given clear and concise commands. He chose to submit and was taken into custody. Sergeant Stevens was about 12 feet away from McClain. McClain told Sergeant Stevens, you don't have the right to search me. He knew two things. One, it was the police, and the two, he was being contacted. He knew that also presented a problem for our officers, that there was something that he did not want contact with the police for. At that point, they had no idea, other than the fact that they knew he was armed. In the officers' minds, they were to prevent a violent confrontation and yet deal with this man who had a concealed weapon who was on a public street a short time ago. Officer Linfoot, who is now in the alley of 1620 Allard, with his car running and his window down, heard the sergeant yelling a half a block away and sped around the block to cover Sergeant Stevens. When he arrived, he got out of his car and focused on the person with the gun while Sergeant Stevens gave clear verbal commands. Linfoot was on the sidewalk next to the fence on the west side of the property. At that point, Linfoot could clearly see the gun in his waistband. Tommy McClain put his hands up, and initially complied. Stevens gave a new command. Quote, "I see the gun. Don't touch it, or I will shoot." McClain, for an unexplained reason, began to drop his hands toward the gun. Now both officers became more assertive and more aggressive, directing McClain in a loud voice, "Put your hands in the air." McClain raised them slightly. Stevens was going to have McClain walk forward and prone himself out on the ground so he could be taken into custody safely. They could take the gun away from him. As observed by 3 officers, McElroy still on the fence line about 20 yards away, the 2 officers on point, and then Officer Harkness had gone down the street to jump over the fence to get up there and cover Sergeant Stevens. As observed by 3 officers, for an unknown reason, Tommy McClain dropped his hands and grabbed the gun. Linfoot, who was 12 feet away, had sight alignment on his torso and fired, striking McClain. Stevens, who was still giving commands when the event took place, was at the high ready position. And he had taken slack out of his trigger